Good to see you again this evening, and so glad that we've got this opportunity to be together. It ought to be something that we never take for granted, that we have the privilege of doing what we're doing right now. In certain places in the world, even now, where we wouldn't have this liberty, and we have it so freely in this country, we sometimes take it for granted. But it is a wonderful privilege that we have to assemble publicly and openly, and just to be together in order to study from God's Word and to honor Him with our worship. It's no small or trivial thing that we're doing here for this hour. We're talking in these lessons about some ways that we can let our light shine. These lessons go all the way back to several years ago in a vacation Bible study that I put these lessons together. There are 5 of them, and so that's a Monday through Friday VBS kind of format. And as I remember it that year, my responsibility was to teach the adult class. And so these were the topics as I presented them to adults that week. But they're obviously lessons that would be easily adapted to our younger people. The longer I live, the more it seems to me that things that are very applicable to our children are also very applicable to us. I find some great sermon outlines and ideas in children's books. And so that's where this material came from, and I hope that it will be helpful to us as adults. Is our PowerPoint not up tonight? Or am I standing up at the right time preaching? I mean, I'm not even supposed to be up here right now. There we go. Okay. We're going to talk tonight about caring and sharing, about the simple power of doing things that help other people. Every day that we live, we have opportunities to do that, some bigger opportunities than others. But this is like the other topics that we're talking about this week. This is something that's not only right to do, but it's an influential thing to do. Something by which we can touch the lives of other people. In the 6th chapter of Galatians, in verse 2, Paul talked about helping other people bear their burdens, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. If there was anything that characterized Jesus' own life while he was in this world, it was that he did, as Peter described it in Acts chapter 10 and verse 38, when he said Jesus went about doing good. That's about the shortest description that I could think of how Jesus lived his life. He went about doing good. He was not just concerned about other people in his thinking, he was actively concerned about the sick and the dying, those who were bereaved and the lonely, the downtrodden, the despised, the poor, the aged, and the children, and everybody else in the world who needs some kind of help. Jesus helped those people as he had the opportunity. Jesus didn't help all of the people in the world, even when he was here. He only helped some. He helped those whose paths crossed his, whom he had some direct opportunity to help. And so he set us the example of doing that. And here in Galatians 6, Paul says that it is in helping other people bear their burdens that we fulfill the law of Christ. We can't be Christ-like without caring about others and sharing with them the help that we're sometimes able to give to them. That's a part of being a Christian, and I would suggest a very important part of being a Christian. I don't think that, as I remember my childhood, I don't remember that being emphasized as much as some other parts of Christianity. I seem to remember when I was growing up that great emphasis was placed upon being at all the services of the church, holding right doctrinal beliefs about various things, and being sound in the faith. And those things certainly need to be emphasized. We can't walk with the Lord without paying attention to those parts of the gospel. But this business of caring and sharing, maybe my memory fails me, but I don't remember that being emphasized as much as it should have been as an important part of what it is to be a Christian. In James chapter 1 and verse 27, when James is talking about pure and undefiled religion, he gave both a positive and a negative description of that. He said, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this. First of all, he gives a a positive example, to visit the orphans and the widows in their trouble. There's two examples of people that would need some help. And then the negative side of it, to keep oneself unspotted from the world. We need to be careful that we don't define our faithfulness to the Lord merely in terms of things we don't do. I think sometimes people do that. They think, I'm a righteous person because I don't cuss, and I don't cheat, and I don't murder, and I don't lie and steal and all those things. And we ought not to do those things. But that's only the negative side of it. That's the thou shalt nots. In addition to that, there are the things that we should do. And James here gives some examples when he says that helping people who have no parents, and widows who've been bereaved by the loss of their husband in their distress. And those would simply be examples of people that we might have the opportunity to help. And that positive side of it is as much a part of the gospel as the negative side of not doing the things that are ungodly. Somebody asked you to define the word benevolence. What would you say? You studied Latin, and very few people anymore have studied Latin in school, but you would recognize that that's a compound word that comes from two Latin words that literally mean good will. If you have a benevolent inclination towards somebody, that means you wish them well. You want to help them rather than hurt them. The opposite of that is what? Malevolent, which means ill will, that you want to hurt. Your intent is to hurt. So benevolent means that you are inclined to do good. But benevolence is more than just a mood or a sentiment. It needs to be a way that we live. Our benevolence needs to be active. We ought not just to wish people well, but to do things that would help them in positive ways. James says in James chapter 2 that our faith alone will not save us. We think that we're going to be saved just because we believe that there is a God. We're far from the truth. James says even the devils believe that. But the devils don't do anything about the fact that they believe there is a God, and our faith alone will not save us. We've got to care, and we've got to share with other people. We certainly get a vivid example of that in the early chapters of the book of Acts, don't we? One of the things that is emphasized in more than one place in those early chapters of Acts is how unselfishly they helped one another. Many of them perhaps were in Jerusalem when the gospel began to be preached on Pentecost, and they were there from foreign lands and perhaps stayed in Jerusalem after they'd obeyed the gospel and didn't have some of the necessities of life. But the brethren were very unselfish in sharing what they had, and some of them even went so far as to sell possessions in order to raise the money to help one another. We see that in Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and following, and also in the 4th chapter of Acts. They just were very generous. Many of them made great sacrifices in order to help one another. And when we talk about patterning ourselves after the New Testament church, that's a part of the pattern. Pattern is not literally that it requires us to sell what we have, sell everything that we have and give to the poor. The pattern is the pattern of generosity and benevolence and the eagerness to help whenever there is a need. You might think we don't see as much of that now as you would have seen in those early days of the church in Jerusalem, and maybe that's true. But my impression is that living as we do in a very affluent society, there's a sense in which there's not as much weekly opportunity to help, especially needy brethren, as would have been the case back then. We live in a land where there's all kinds of help available for anybody in almost any kind of a problem. So there's not the immediate pressing need to help the poor, as would have been the case in those early days in Jerusalem. But my impression is that when a need does arise, that our brethren today are very, very generous in rising to meet that need. I was reminded of that all over again over the last week or so when the hurricane hit in the Northeast. I was living down on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi in 1969 when Hurricane Camille hit down there and destroyed everything. 300 some odd lives were lost, and many people lost everything they had. And I was just astonished at the outpouring of help and offers for help that came from brethren all over the country and all over the world who were eager to help if there was any kind of need. And I think our brethren are generous. When there is a need brought to their attention, they are very, very sacrificial in rising to help meet that need. And that's the way it should be. We can't claim to be Christians if we're not willing to care and to share. Paul mentions in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, in regard to the Macedonians who had just insisted on helping out in this aid that was being gotten together for the needy saints down in Jerusalem. Even though the Macedonians themselves were poor, they wanted to help. And Paul says that was because they had first given themselves to the Lord. 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 5. That's what happens when you give yourself to the Lord. Then anything that you have is His for the asking. Any time, any money, any resources, any possessions. If all that we have is the Lord, then we generously give of His to help in His work. But if we haven't given ourselves to the Lord, then we become more stingy of what we think belongs to us. We talked this morning about gratitude. I think what we're talking about tonight is an outgrowth of gratitude. The more grateful we are for what God has blessed us with, then the more willing we will be to part with some of that occasionally in order to help somebody else. Paul asked a very pertinent question in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7, when he said, "What do you have that you did not receive?" What do any of us have that has not been graciously given to us by God? And how dare we be stingy with that which the Lord has provided us? So as we find in the 25th chapter of Matthew, when the sheep and the goats were separated, and the question of the goats was why they were being lost, when the Lord answered that question, He said, "You didn't do certain things to me that you had the opportunity to do." And they said, "When, Lord, did we fail to ever help you?" He said, "Well, when you failed to help others of my people," these children as He described them, when you failed to help those you could have helped, you were withholding that help from me. And that has to do with salvation. That passage clearly portrays the possibility that some will be lost because of things they did not do to help others when they could have. So we can't be weary in doing good, as Paul describes it in Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. But being that way is not easy in our culture, because our culture emphasizes self-centeredness. And living in this kind of an atmosphere, it's hard to be selfless, to be more concerned about others than about ourselves. Everything about modern culture is centered on what self wants and what self thinks it has a right to enjoy. Most people are just unabashedly concerned about themselves. It's about me, what I want, and what I have a right to do and to enjoy. And living in that kind of an environment, it's hard to rise above that and to be back in touch with the fact that in the gospel, the emphasis runs in a whole different direction. For one thing, the way we live our lives today tends to cut us off from the people that are even immediately around us. We live such busy lives today, particularly in city environments where we live in a metropolitan culture, where we maybe sometimes have a long commute to work every morning and then a long commute back, and we're just worn out on the weekends, and we live in neighborhoods where we hardly know our neighbors. In the cities, we're packed closer and closer together into more densely packed communities where we are strangers from one another. We live in close physical proximity to one another, but the irony of modern life is that we know the people right around us much less than used to be the case when we were more spread out. And so modern life tends to isolate us from one another. I just have to tell you, in the condominiums where I live, I barely know my next door neighbors on either side of me. I mean, I do know them, I've met them, and I know their name, but we have very little contact. We just briefly see one another in passing once every few days. There's no real human contact. And the tragedy of that is that they could have a serious need that I might be able to help with that I would never know about, because we don't have much contact. We're not entwined or involved in one another's life any more than just briefly saying hi as we pass one another in our busy lives. We're cut off from those around us, and we really don't know how we could help others. I believe being a Christian involves a Christ-like effort to get past that, to resist the influences of modern life that tear us apart from other human beings, and to try to maintain some of those human contacts that I believe are so important. If that takes going against the current of our culture, then I believe we just need to do that. I was in a part of the country earlier this year. Well, I'll just say it was in the Northeast. I won't say what state it was, but it was in the Northeast. And as I was up there visiting and talking with people about what evangelism would be like in that part of the country, and I really wanted to move there. Didn't work out, but and talking with them, they said, "Well, Gary, there's one thing you need to understand is that people in this part of the country are not as friendly as they are back down where you come from, and you'd need to be a little bit more careful not to be too friendly because that would be suspect to some extent. If you tried to have as much contact with people as you ordinarily have in the South, people would put a big question over that and wonder, what you were up to." And I thought, well, that would take some getting used to if I lived in a part of the country where people question you being friendly. I talked to a preacher who preached for this very same congregation where I was thinking about moving many years ago, who told me that going door to door one day trying to find people to study the Bible with him, he had a lady spit on him. It wasn't enough just to say, "No, I'm not interested." She felt compelled to spit on him. In that kind of a culture, people just withdraw inside their own little cocoons, and they live in their own silos and live their own lives, and they really don't know much significantly about the people that they're packed so tightly together with in these kinds of areas. And that's a tragic loss, because we don't care and we don't share in those kinds of environments as we ought to. But we can't allow our culture to be an excuse to say, well, times are different. Times may be different, but human beings are basically what they have always been. They hurt in all the same places that people ever have hurt in. They have the same needs. And we need to find the opportunities to be Christ's agents in situations where some help can be rendered that would let some light shine from our lives that ultimately would result in the Lord being glorified. One thing we need to understand is that in our modern culture, we are surrounded by hurting, desperate, lonely souls who don't know that there is anybody else who cares for them. And that's such a shame. It's a tragedy to me to know that, particularly in our cities, we've just got so many millions of people who, while they're living in those densely packed metropolitan areas, are the loneliest people in the world. They're living lonely lives in the midst of a huge multitude of other strangers. Somebody said we're all lonely together in this world, and that's probably a good way of describing it. You take it for granted that you've got this family here at Laurel Canyon, and that if you had a need, there'd be people who would care about you and would come riding to your rescue. And maybe we get to the point where we take this relationship for granted. But let me tell you, there are millions, billions of people in this world, if you think of the whole world, who don't have what you have here at Laurel Canyon, who are isolated. For all they know, there is not a single human being in the world who cares about them or would help them if they had some kind of a need. Listen, I've been asked on more than one occasion by a funeral director to come and say some words at the grave site of some nameless individual, perhaps some homeless person who had died and needed to be buried, and at the public expense, that nobody knew, and really it wasn't even known who that person was. Just died, born into some kind of a family. They had a mother and a father that brought them into the world, but they grew up and they lived a life, sometimes of many years in this world, and when it came down to the end of it, nobody even knew who they were. Totally alone in this world. That's sad. But you know, the Lord knows who those people are. And the Lord wants us to be those through whom those people find that there is somebody who cares about them. And it's the Lord, if nobody else. We need to look for those people who think that nobody cares about them and let them know that the Lord cares. And that there are great things in store for those who will let the Lord care for them. The cry of lament in the 142nd Psalm that I think all of us can relate to. It's one of David's cries at one of the distressing times in his life. And he said in Psalm 142, verse 4, "Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul." Do you ever feel that way? Well, we all do. And everybody else in the world feels that way. If you think you sometimes struggle to wonder if anybody cares for you, imagine if you didn't have this relationship that you've got at Laurel Canyon. Imagine if you were one of the millions of people in the world who maybe nobody knows your name at all, has no connection to you. What a desperate feeling. Well, at the cross, God was saying, not only do I care about all of you, here's how much I care. And the message of the cross is that God cares about every person whom He's ever created. Do you and I care for all of those for whom God cares? Are you willing to seek out those people and find them and be the agents through whom God administers His care to them? Is anybody who's ever found out through you that somebody does care and that came as news to them? It's wonderful good news when somebody finds out that they're not alone in the world. And we have the opportunity to be those people through whom lonely souls, desperate souls can find out that God cares and God's people care. And a great light will shine from our lives when we live our lives looking for those people whom we can touch in the Lord's name and let them know that contrary to what it looks like in this desperate world, the God who created them cares for them enough to have given His Son to bring them back to Him. When we try to help other people, even in physical ways, as the Lord said, to give that cup of cold water in His name, our ultimate aim, obviously, is always that we would like, at some point, to be able to share the gospel with those people. I reject what has sometimes been called the social gospel, that the gospel is just about trying to remove as much of the suffering from this world as possible. Yes, it is nice, to the extent of opportunity, to modify the suffering that's in the world, to feed a few of the hungry people and to clothe a few of the naked people, to help when we're able to help in some kind of a physical way. But as long as this world stands, we will not ever take all of the suffering out of it. We can help, and when we do, that's a big help to those individuals who receive the help. You never fail to help just because you can't solve all the problems in the world. If you've helped somebody with a specific problem, you've helped them. And that makes it worth doing, regardless of whether in the larger scale you're going to change the nature of the world. You're not going to do that. The gospel is not about making this world a better place in which to live. The kingdom is not of this world. The kingdom that the Lord came to establish was not just about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and healing the sick. And we need to be careful we don't leave that impression that the main thing about the gospel is going out into the world and trying to help people who are suffering with physical problems. What we want ultimately to do is to share the gospel of the forgiveness of their sins with them. Of all the problems that people have, that's the number one problem that they have, whether they recognize that problem or not. And the problem is that most people don't even recognize that they have that problem. When you're hungry, that's obvious. When you're destitute, that's obvious. But even if those problems could be solved for you, somebody could help you in those kind of ways, if you stay in your lost condition spiritually, then you really haven't gotten the help that you needed to get. So when we help other people in the Lord's name by giving them some kind of physical help, what we need to understand is that ultimately the thing we would like most to share with them is the gospel. But I want to be careful in saying that. I've never been comfortable making the gospel some kind of hidden agenda that you have. So that's what you're really trying to do, but you keep that around your back here, and so you're helping people with physical needs just as a means to get a chance to share the gospel with them. I don't like hidden agendas. And when somebody has an agenda with me, I'd really rather know what they're about up front. But we don't always get the chance to share the gospel with somebody. So I kind of like to think of it simply in terms of wanting to do all the good somebody will let you do. If the only way they will let you help them is with a physical problem, and you've got the opportunity to help with that, you go ahead and offer the help that they will let you help them with, but you're wanting to help them with greater problems than that. I think that was Jesus' approach, wasn't he? He fed the multitude on the day when he multiplied the loaves and the fishes. He fed the multitude because they were hungry that day. When they came back the next day looking for another meal, Jesus said in John chapter 6, you've come back looking for more loaves and fishes. He said, I wish you were more interested in the food that lasts to eternal life. What he was saying is, I can help you with all different kinds of problems. I helped you with a rather low-level problem yesterday, your physical hunger, and I was glad to do that. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you were grateful for it. But I wish you would let me help you with a worse problem than physical hunger. Many of them weren't willing to be helped with that. But that didn't stop Jesus from helping them where he could, but he was always looking for opportunities to help them with the higher problems. And I think that's kind of got to be our procedure. You help people at whatever level they will let you help them. Always being open and frank and honest about the fact that there are some higher levels of help that you really would rather have the opportunity to help them with, and you're going to keep after them until they will at least sit down and let you share with them some things about the gospel. I don't know how often you have people come to the building here looking for some kind of physical, financial help. If you're like churches in most places, you get those kind of calls occasionally from people that will maybe show up at services, and they'll hang around after services and they want to talk to somebody about needing some money. Well, those can sometimes be difficult situations to handle. It would take the wisdom of a Solomon to know what to do in some of those situations. But I've kind of gotten in the habit of asking those people, before I give them the financial help, if they will give me 45 minutes to share the gospel with them. I'll take you to the gas station, put some gas in your tank, or I'll take you to the grocery store and buy you some groceries if you'll give me 45 minutes of your time to share the gospel with you. And if somebody says, no, I'm not going to give you 45 minutes of my time to talk with me about that, I just want the money, I'm much less inclined to give the money. If there's not a give and a take here, I don't always apply that rule. But I think it's entirely appropriate for us to be upfront about the fact that the help that we have here is primarily spiritual. That's the problems that we're really wanting to help people with. Yes, we will help as we have opportunity in other areas, but we want to be very open and honest about the fact that the thing all of us need more than we need anything else is the gospel. And we're looking for opportunities to help people with that, all the while being willing to give the cup of cold water in the Lord's name when we have the opportunity to do that. We just always ought to be eager to help in whatever ways people will allow us to help them, understanding that it may be your willingness to help them with that physical problem that later on causes them to open up their minds to what you have to say about some other things. Sometimes you have to earn the right to be heard. Sometimes people won't listen to you until they're sure that you care about them. And it takes sometimes demonstrating that you care about somebody. And there again, we're not talking about a hidden agenda. You're up front with them about what you're really most interested in. But sometimes people have to have some evidence that you really care for them, and it's offering physical help sometimes that can demonstrate to them that you really do care. When we fail to do that, that's a serious error. And just as we said this morning, we sometimes excuse our failure to express our gratitude to God and to other people by making various excuses. We do the same thing with caring and sharing. We sometimes say, well, I know I should have done that, but I just wasn't thinking, or I didn't have the time, or it wasn't convenient at that moment, or I was afraid to help. That really is a concern in this day and time, isn't it? It's dangerous to involve yourself in some situations where help needs to be rendered. But I'm not sure danger is a sufficient justification not to help. When I lived up in Indianapolis, Indiana, before I moved to Nashville, where I am now, one Christmas morning while I lived there, there was a fellow who was killed by a hit-and-run driver out on the interstate who had stopped to help a person change the tire on their car. They'd had a flat and they'd pulled over on the shoulder of the interstate. Christmas morning, this person was by themselves. It was before daylight. This person stopped to help them change their tire, and it was on the traffic side of the car, and someone hit him and killed him and didn't even stop. Killed on Christmas morning trying to help somebody change their tire. Well, stopping to change that tire was a dangerous thing to do. And that's why most people wouldn't stop to do it. That's why most of the cars were flying by while he alone had stopped to try to help this person, because it's dangerous to help people in all kinds of ways. But you know, it was dangerous for Jesus to come into this world to help us. But he did it anyway. He ran the risk. He suffered the loss. He paid the price to help. And if we're going to be his people, we're going to have to emulate that. When we fail to do that, that's the same as inflicting cruelty and injury on the people that we fail to help. That's the point of the story of the Good Samaritan, isn't it, in Luke chapter 10. There's a man who's lying on the side of the road, injured and needing help. The priest and the Levite passed by on the other side of the road. Why? I don't know. Maybe they were on their way to the temple to offer sacrifices. They didn't have time to help. They maybe thought it was dangerous. And it probably would have been. There would have been some risk involved in that day and time, just as there is now, in trying to help somebody that you don't know in an uncertain circumstance. And so for whatever reason, they chose not to help. So here comes this Samaritan who renders the help that the other two wouldn't help. I doubt very seriously that the priest and the Levite who didn't help the injured man, they wouldn't have gone over to him and kicked him and helped him, hurt him even further. And they would have deplored the wrongful actions of the thieves that beat that fellow up and robbed him. They would have said, that was wrong to do that. We are against people who do that. But by not helping him when he needed help, they classed themselves among the same people who inflicted the injury on that fellow in the first place. They may as well have actively hurt him as to not help him when they had the opportunity. So it's a serious neglect. If we just say, well, I just neglected to help that person. That's a serious omission that involves the same thing as hurting someone. You've probably heard this saying many times, I expect to pass this way but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do or any kindness that I can show to any fellow creature, let me do it now. Let me not defer or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. Several years ago, when my two sons and I lived in San Antonio, Texas, we were running late to Wednesday night Bible study one night. And as we were coming through the neighborhood within a block or two of the church building, hurrying to get there, we passed by the house of a man who apparently was a paraplegic. And he had a motorized wheelchair, and he had motored down to the end of his driveway to get his mail. And as he had turned around to kind of come back, one of the wheels of his motorized chair had gotten off of the concrete on the driveway, and it was stuck. Well, obviously a need there for help. But we were running late to Bible study, and I told Brock and I said, I'd love to help the fellow, but we have got to get to Bible study. I've got to teach a class tonight, and we are running late. Somebody else will help him. Well, unless he's there today, somebody probably did help him. But I'll tell you, there's never a more shameful moment in my life when I reflected on what I had done. What kind of example was I setting for my two sons? What do I think we would learn at Bible study that night, if not to help people when we have got the opportunity? For all I know, the priest and the Levite were on their way to worship service at the temple when they failed to help that guy. That may have been the reason they didn't have time to do that. But we miss the point of what we do when we're here. If when we're out there, we're not doing what the Lord would do in those situations. But we may think there's not anything we can do in our own little individual lives that would be of much help to anybody. But that underestimates what God would be able to do through us if we'd give Him half a chance. We would be willing to do what He is able to do. That may be far beyond the ability that we think we have personally. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 8, God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. Fact is, the Lord has blessed us with way more opportunity to do good than we take advantage of. It's not a problem of me not being able to do anything that would help anybody. God will supply the wherewithal if we'll be willing to be His agents and His servants. We need to do what the widow did that we mentioned this morning, who put just the 2 mites into the temple treasury. We need to do what we can do, whether that seems much or little. And not just to do it grudgingly, but to be a cheerful giver of help whenever it is needed. As the song says, Christ has no hands but our hands to do His work today. So these hands are Christ's hands, and when they help someone, they are doing what He would do if He were in those situations. When we do that, then we always experience the truth of Jesus saying, that Paul quotes in Acts 20, when he says it is more blessed to give than to receive. And when we live as givers more than receivers, then the light of the Lord's truth shines from our life. And it will have the same effect in other people's lives as it had when that light shone originally from the Lord's own life. And people were drawn to that. So I hope that has been helpful to you. It challenges us all, doesn't it? In these busy days, to take the time to help folks and to be the Lord's servants in those helping kinds of situations. One of the reasons why it is so bad for us to stay as busy as we are right now, we don't allow any slack in our schedules. We use up every minute that's allotted to us 24 hours a day. We don't have any spare time anymore. And so when people needs arise at inconvenient times, as they often do, we don't have any time with which to help anybody because we've already spent all we have. Just as if we spend all of the money that comes our way, we don't have any money to help somebody with when a need arises. One reason to slow down these days is to be accessible and available when people need us. And so may God help us to do that. If you're here tonight and we can help you in your obedience to the gospel, that's what we want to do. And that needs to be uppermost in our minds right now as we sing this song of encouragement and exhortation If there's some step you need to take, that you know you need to take because you've read in God's Word and you know that applies to you, and we can help you with that tonight, then the invitation song is for you, and we hope you'll come to the front right now and let us know of that while we stand and sing.